Om Tyageshwaram Ramakrishna Saradam Matra Rupinim Vivekanandamacharyam Natva Vakshami Shuddhe Yogena Chittasya Padena Vacha Amalam Sharirasya Cha Bhaishajena Yopakarottam Pravaram Muninam Patanjalim Pranjalirarunatosmi. We have been discussing this Patanjali Yoga Sutras. Vrittis was the subject, mental modifications. Because restraint of the vrittis is how yoga was defined by Patanjali. Chitta vritti nirodha. So how many types of vrittis are there which are to be restrained? That was the subject. And one division of vrittis was klishta and aklishta vrittis. Vrittis, emotions that lead us to bondage, are called klishta vrittis, and which lead us to freedom and knowledge, those are called aklishta vrittis. That was one definition, we discussed that. That was one division, we discussed that. The other division is vrittayaha panchatayaha, 5 types of mental modifications. See, all our experiences, they have a vritti. Every experience has a vritti behind it. Without vritti, there cannot be any experience. Without mental modification, there cannot be experience. So he classifies all the vrittis that our mind passes throughout the 24 hours into 5 types. Vrittayaha panchatayaha. 5 types of vrittis. Pramana, viparyaya, vikalpa, nidra, smrtaya. 5 types of vrittis were there. And we discussed pramana vrittis. He defines pramanas as pratyaksha, anumana, agamani, pramanani. What is a pramana? Pramana is the instrument of prama. Instrument of right knowledge is pramana. So it's a mental modification which gives us prama, which gives us right knowledge. That mental modification which gives us right knowledge is called pramana vritti. Right knowledge is that knowledge which is fresh, which is new, as distinct from memory, and which is not contradicted. Such knowledge alone is right knowledge. Such knowledge is prama. And the mental modification that gives us that knowledge is called pramana, pramana vritti. And Patanjali accepts 3 kinds of pramana vrittis, that is 3 means through which we get right knowledge, correct knowledge. 3 ways in which we know things correctly. Pratyaksha, anumana and agama. This is what we discussed in our last class. Pratyaksha is sensory perception. We hear something, we smell something with our senses. That sense-object contact will create a mental modification which will give us the knowledge of the object. The senses are involved, no doubt, but their role is auxiliary, sahakari. The main instrument, chief instrument, is the mental modification, which gives us that this is a sweet smell or this is a sweet taste, whatever it is. That right knowledge that comes on account of a mental modification. That is called pratyaksha pramana vritti because it is caused due to sense-object contact and the mind taking the form of the object. So that is pratyaksha pramana vritti. Then there is anumana, that is inference. We see an indicator, linga, and from that the indicated is inferred. We see smoke, and the fire is inferred. This is the right knowledge. It is not contradicted. If we go near, we'll find really there is fire. From a distance we see smoke, we infer there is fire. We go near and we see there is fire. So this knowledge gained from a distance, based only on the perception of smoke, knowledge of fire, is right knowledge. It is Brahma. Whole thing happens in a flash, but there are a lot of stages in it. But the vritti which gives us the knowledge of the fire, seeing the smoke, that vritti is called Anumana Pramana vritti. The inferred object is known from the indicator, from the linga. That vritti is called Anumana vritti. And then there is Agama Pramana, Shabda Pramana, the words of the trustworthy persons. From a trustworthy person we hear something. There is knowledge in that trustworthy person. That trustworthy person has first-hand experience, either by pratyaksha or anumana. That knowledge is transferred to us through words. When we hear from a trustworthy person that such and such a house is on fire, we get that knowledge that such and such a house is on fire. And there is a vritti behind that knowledge caused by the words of the trustworthy person. That vritti is called Agama Pramana vritti or Shabda Pramana vritti. The knowledge is transferred through words of a trustworthy person. And it is Prama. We go near that house and we find really it is on fire. So it was Prama, caused by the words of a trustworthy person. And there was a vritti behind that knowledge. When we heard, we were not seeing. It was not a pratyaksha. We heard it, but the person is trustworthy. His or her words can be trusted. So that created a vritti in our mind. And that vritti gave rise to knowledge that such and such a house is on fire. And it was Prama, it is Prama. So that vritti is called Agama Pramana vritti, Shabda Pramana vritti. And all these three pramanas we use in our day-to-day life. We infer, we act on the inferences, we act on the words of the trustworthy person. And of course, we act on what we see. So, pratyaksha, anumana, agama, these pramanas we use in our day-to-day life. When it comes to spiritual life, this Shabda Pramana is very important because all the knowledge about the self, bondage, liberation, all that, we have to trust the words of the trustworthy persons. And in spiritual life, these persons are called aptas, persons who have attained spiritual illumination, so to say. They are called aptas. Not everyone can be an apta, and not everyone's words can be accepted. For a person to be apta, for a person's words to be accepted as apta vakyas, few criteria are there. One is that person should have had first-hand experience. Then only that person's words can be accepted. Person who has realized his or her real nature, such a person's words will be valid when it comes to spiritual life. Only then can he or she talk about the self, talk about liberation, talk about bondage, and the ways and means to attain to liberation. Secondly, that person must be perfectly unselfish. No impurity should be there in that person. This is a characteristic when it comes to spiritual life. We are not talking of material life, of the teachers of physics and law and all that. But spiritual life, that person has to be absolutely pure. Then only he or she can be called an apta. Thirdly, that person cannot appropriate the knowledge only to himself or herself. If he or she says that I have realized and only I can realize, you cannot realize, you just have to believe me, then it's not an aptavakya. It should be verifiable even by anyone who strives for it, who meets the condition. It should be verifiable. That's why it's called scientific. Just as scientific experiences can be verified by anyone provided the conditions are met, so also what the aptas tell us, what the Upanishads tell us, it can be verified in our life if we meet those conditions. And last criteria is it should pertain to the supersensory realm. Aptavakya has to pertain to supersensory realm, not something that we can see, verify with our eyes and ears or inference. So these are the conditions for a person to be an apta and for his or her words to be aptavakya. Here also the process is same. When the student is ready, fully equipped, qualified, then the knowledge that the apta has is transferred to the disciple through those words. And a mental modification happens, takes place in the mind of the listener, in the mind of the disciple, the content of which is same as the experience of the teacher. When the teacher speaks, he or she conveys his experience. The listener, the student hears, a modification happens in his or her mind, and that brings out knowledge which is same as the knowledge of the teacher. So the knowledge of the teacher is transferred to a student through words and through a mental modification. That mental modification is called Atmaprananandaji. Question comes, what about the ordinary teachers who have not realized? There, if the ordinary teacher quotes the authority of those who have realized, then it is okay, because he or she is not quoting on one's own authority. But if someone starts quoting himself or herself without having realized, then it won't be aptavakya. If a person has not realized the self and talks on one's own authority, those words simply won't have the capacity to generate knowledge in the minds of the disciples. That power will not be there. That's why it will not be an aptavakya, because it fails the condition that apta should have realized, should have had the first-hand experience. So that will not work. Only when a person speaks from the authority of experience, those words have the potential, have the capacity to generate that agama pramana, vritti, and the knowledge. So the intermediary teachers can only quote the aptas. They cannot be aptas. So long as they have not realized the self, they cannot be aptas. So this is the pramana vritti, one type of vritti of the 5, which was subdivided into 3 vrittis. The next type of vritti is pramana viparyaya. So viparyaya is viparyayo mithya jnanam atadrupa pratishtham. Viparyaya is translated as misapprehension. Misapprehension is mithya jnana, false knowledge. Misapprehension is false knowledge. Atadrupa pratishtham, which doesn't have real thing as its basis. Which doesn't have real thing as its basis. We have this experience. This is also one of the vrittis which happens in our mind stuff. The common example given is we see from a distance our friend standing. and we want to meet him or her, so we go near. Having gone near, we find that it's not our friend, but it's a post, or it is somebody else. Till we went near enough to understand that it is not what we thought, we had a mental vritti. When we saw from a distance, there was a mental modification which gave knowledge that this is so and so. As we went near, it turned out to be otherwise. So it was not Brahma that we had in the beginning. It was contradicted. But that false knowledge had a vritti behind it. That vritti is called viparya vritti. So viparya vritti gives rise to false knowledge, which is contradicted. We see it in our day-to-day life many times. So there are so many examples in scriptures also. Rajju Sarpa is a very famous example. You see from a distance a snake, and then we start looking for a stick and all that. And when the light is brought, it's found to be a rope. But the experience of snake happened because of a vritti. Without vritti, there is no experience. So that vritti which gives us false knowledge is called viparya vritti. And there is a lot of discussion about how this happens and how to get rid of it. Because our whole empirical life is a life of viparya. We are the self, pure, consciousness, infinite. When it comes to our own idea about ourselves, there is this viparya. There is viparya, there is false knowledge, misapprehension about our idea about ourselves. Our real nature is something different, and we have taken ourselves to be something different. Atadrupa pratishtam. The knowledge that we have about ourselves presently is not based on the reality of our nature. And hence, this fact of viparya is a matter of discussion in philosophical literature. Bhagwan Shankaracharya calls it adhyasa, superimposition. Superimposing one thing on the other. But the reason all accept is ignorance. Ignorance of the real nature of the thing we are trying to know. Because there is ignorance, there is false knowledge, there is misapprehension. And hence the remedy is knowledge. Knowledge will destroy ignorance, and that ignorance destroyed, false knowledge, misapprehension will also be destroyed. So that's how this viparya, akhyati, anyatha akhyati, like that, various ways of interpreting this viparya, misapprehension, false knowledge, and in our philosophical literature, there is a lot of discussion about it. So this was the second vritti, pramana viparya. Third is vikalpa. This is a kind of a strange vritti that we have. It's a mental modification, no doubt. Shabda jnana anupati, vastu shunyo vikalpaha. That's how he defines vikalpa. What is vikalpa? It's a mental modification which follows shabda jnana. Shabda jnana anupati. So we hear some words and their meaning. We hear some words and we understand the meaning. So there is shabda jnana. Following that, there is a vritti, a mental modification. Following the hearing of the words and understanding the meaning. But vastu shunya, there is no reality in the outside world to corroborate with what we have heard and understood. That mental modification is called a vikalpa. It can be translated as a fancy or mental construction or verbal construction, whatever you call it. It follows the words and their meaning, but it has no corroborating object in the external world. Some examples are given, 2-3 examples are given. The son of a barren woman, that is one example given. Son of a barren woman. We hear the words, son of a barren woman. We know what is a son, we know what is a woman, we know what is a barren. We know what is the relation between son and a mother. We understand the words, we understand their meanings, but when we try to construct it and understand the meaning and find something outside, there is nothing. It is vastu shunya. That the mental modification did arise on hearing the words because we know their meaning. It is not that we do not know the meaning. If we hear words from a strange language, even that will perhaps create some mental modification. But here it is Shabda Jnana Anupati. So we know the words, their meaning, we hear those words and we understand the meaning, but there is no object corroborating to what we have understood. There is one example given. That mental vritti, which is vastu shunya, which has no object corroborating to it, but which is generated by hearing of words or reading of words and understanding their meaning, that is called vikalpa. It's also a mental vritti. It's also a mental modification. It is called vikalpa. The other example given is consciousness of the Purusha. Purusha means self or the Atman. Consciousness of the Atman. You see, we understand what is consciousness, we understand what is Atman, we understand the relation between possessing things, like the cow of a Chaitra. But the very nature of the self is consciousness. The very nature of Atman is consciousness. So consciousness of Atman, this relation between the qualified and the qualifier, the possessor and the possessed, there is no corroborating reality outside. Because Atman itself is consciousness. Like that, so this vritti, which follows the Shabda and Jnana, but has no corroborating reality, it's called Vikalpa vritti. And modern commentators and some other commentators, they have given another example of this Vikalpa, which we find in our day-to-day life. A person starts speaking. Before he or she has completed, we jump to conclusion. That person starts, Mr. X, and I get up, so he has come, let us welcome him. That person has not finished. Maybe he or she is trying to tell that he is not coming. But I hear the words, jump to a conclusion, which has no corroborating reality. So that vritti, which gives this kind of knowledge, which has no corroborating reality, but it is generated by words and their meaning, that vritti is called Vikalpa vritti. So these are the 3 vrittis we have discussed. One is Pramana, Viparyaya and Vikalpa. There are 2 more types of vrittis in which we pass our life. One is Nidra, that is a state of deep sleep, Sushupti. And then there is Smriti or memory, which we'll discuss in our next class. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Sri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.